Mr. President, we are a week into Trump administration, and it can be summed up in one word: lawlessness. Trump is showing every day with nearly every action that he has zero regard for the laws of this country, from pardoning en masse violent insurrectionists to illegally firing government watchdogs charged with holding him accountable, to issuing blatantly unconstitutional executive orders, to asking OMB to halt funding Congress passed, something that is now causing serious chaos and harm to red states and blue states. We are not going to let his strategy of overwhelming chaos win the day. We are fighting each of the actions, and we will not stop asserting our power as an equal branch of the government. But right now, today, we're going to focus on one issue in particular, one that is not just alarming, but actually personal to all of us here in the Senate, because it concerns the Capitol Police each of us walk by every single day. I have made it clear I will not sit back and allow President Trump to rewrite the history of the January 6th insurrection. Already, his Justice Department has taken down the public database that laid out the thousands of investigations. He is literally trying to erase the evidence from public memory. But no president can rewrite history, not unless we stand by and let him. And that is absolutely not going to happen. We will not forget what really happened here on January 6, 2021. As we all remember, as the American people witnessed in real time, armed insurrectionists, egged on by the sitting president, broke into the U.S. Capitol and violently assaulted Capitol Police officers in their attempt to overturn a free and fair election. You do not have to take my word for it, though like many of my colleagues, I have a first-person account of that day. The reality is well documented in videos, in photos, in case documents from thousands of people charged with felonies after that day, including assault. We know, as a matter of fact, some insurrectionists brought knives, tasers, axes, hatchets, pepper spray, zip ties, and more. We know, as a matter of fact, some assaulted officers with flagpoles, stun guns, fire extinguishers, and bear spray. We know, as a matter of fact, that Capitol Police officers suffered severe injuries as a result, including cracked ribs, smashed spinal discs, brain injuries, and even the loss of an eye. Officers here sacrificed tremendously to keep senators safe, Republicans and Democrats alike. And we have the footage, the photos, police reports that clearly show the crimes and the violence that was committed. So, Mr. President, President Trump's decision to pardon en masse 1,500 people charged in the insurrection is truly an unthinkable attempt to erase the facts of that day and undermine our democracy. But it is especially heinous that he chose to pardon individuals who violently attacked our Capitol Police officers, not to mention commuting the sentences of 14 others, people found guilty of seditious conspiracy, people like Enrique Tarrio, leader of the Proud Boys, and Stuart Rhodes, leader of the Oath Keepers. It is a betrayal of the law enforcement that protected all of us that day, and a dangerous endorsement of political violence, telling criminals that you can beat cops within an inch of their lives as long as it's in service to Donald Trump. Every one of us here owes a tremendous debt of gratitude to our Capitol Police. They protected our lives and they protected our democracy. That is why we are here today to pass a resolution that makes clear the U.S. Senate stands with our Capitol Police officers by disapproving the pardon of those who violently attack the officers who keep us safe. It is a very simple, modest resolution. It reads in its entirety, resolved that the Senate disapproves of any pardons for individuals who were found guilty of assaulting Capitol Police officers. It is that simple. We aren't relitigating every case. This is only about people guilty of assaulting Capitol Police. I made this sure that this was short and clear, something we can pass unanimously, because a message like this really should be unanimous. In fact, Mr. President, just to underscore how straightforward this is, I want to read it in its entirety once again. Resolved, that the Senate disapproves of any pardons for individuals who are found guilty of assaulting Capitol Police officers. That's it, the entire thing. I don't think there's anything here for anyone to disagree with. And I yield to the Democratic leader.
Well, thank you. And let me thank Patty Murray for her leadership on this issue. Now, it's becoming clear, it has become clear already, but it's even clearer today. A pattern is emerging from Donald Trump's presidency, a pattern of lawlessness. He has pardoned insurrectionists. He has fired many of the government's independent watchdogs. And today, or last night, he froze billions, perhaps trillions, of federal grant funding to hospitals and firefighters and seniors and Head Start. Under Donald Trump, it's already clear it's a golden age for lawlessness. Today, Democrats will seek passage of a resolution that talks about one aspect of this lawlessness. We simply condemn pardoning rioters who attacked our Capitol Police officers on January 6th. My colleague Patty Murray, who has done such a great job on this, read the whole resolution. How the heck can anyone object to a resolution that says we should condemn pardoning those who assaulted police officers? Where's the law and order crowd? Where's the people who talk about defunding the police? How do you think every police officer feels when one of their brethren is assaulted and then they're pardoned and their own senators, who represent thousands and thousands of police officers, each in their states, won't even stand up for their fellow officer? I just hope our Republican colleagues don't block this resolution. All of us, every one of us, it doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, every one of us should be able to agree that people who attack police officers don't deserve presidential pardons. And if Republicans stand in the way of this resolution, what an awful message it sends to our own Capitol Police, who we see every day, who work so hard to keep us safe. Let's be clear, the people who invaded the Capitol on January 6th, whether engaged in violence or not, committed a very serious crime. I saw them. I was within 20, 30 feet of them. And now, because of fear of President Trump, the party on the other side says, never mind. One of the worst days in American history. There's no gray area here, and particularly when it comes to people who attack police officers. By handing out these pardons to convicted criminals, President Trump is effectively saying, you want to attack our brave police officers? That's okay. Pardoning lawless rioters is not what Americans want the president to be prioritizing. They want to see answers to problems that impact them: inflation, good-paying jobs, a better future. And they sure as hell don't want to see OMB taking away monies that have been lawfully allocated that they desperately need in so many aspects of their lives. Our Capitol Police deserve nothing less than our full and steadfast support for everything they do to keep us safe. The very least we can do for them as senators is to come together and declare those convicted of attacking Capitol Police officers. We say clearly, with one voice, let's hope, that these people do not deserve a pardon. Yield the floor.
The senator from Washington.
Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of S-Res 42, my resolution condemning the pardons for individuals who were found guilty of assaulting Capitol Police officers, which was submitted earlier today. Further, the resolution be agreed to and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President.
The Republican whip.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. I heard the senator from Washington State said we are now 1 week into the Trump administration. Mr. President, I'm very grateful we're now 1 week beyond the Biden administration. Democrats do not want a serious debate here about the use of presidential pardon power. If they did want a serious conversation, they would talk about Joe Biden's pardons. Over 8,000 of them, Mr. President. The previous president used his final days in office to grant clemency to 37 of 40 of the worst killers on death row. President Biden said time and time again, oh, he wouldn't pardon his son Hunter. No. Not only did he pardon Hunter for the crimes for which he had been convicted, he pardoned him for 10 years of his additional criminal activity, which has not yet been discovered. Then, minutes before leaving office on Inauguration Day, Joe Biden gave preemptive blanket pardons to 5 more members of his own family. If they weren't guilty, why would they need or accept pardons? President Biden commuted the sentences of 2 men who killed a Sussex County police officer. President Biden also commuted the sentence of a killer who executed 2 FBI agents in cold blood. The FBI Agents Association said Biden's pardon was, quote, a cruel betrayal to the families and colleagues of these fallen agents. And that they said that the Biden pardon of this cold-blooded murderer was, quote, a slap in the face of law enforcement. President Biden also commuted the sentence of a drug trafficker involved in the murder of an 8-year-old boy and his mother. The Biden administration actually classified him, believe it or not, as a non-violent offender. Even the Democrat senator from Connecticut said, quote, someone dropped the ball on granting that clemency. In all, more than 8,000 criminals were pardoned or had their sentences reduced by Joe Biden. Now, that's more than any other president in history. It isn't even close. This resolution that the Senate is asked to consider today does not condemn the Biden abuse of the pardon power. It does not condemn the pardons or the commutations of police officer killers, of murderers, of rapists. It ignores the pain and suffering of the victims and their families. I oppose, as do my colleagues on this side of the aisle, any violence against police officers. I oppose pardons of violent criminals. These officers deserve our thanks and our prayers. They deserve not to be used in political games like the ones that the Senate Democrats are playing today on this very floor. Democrats should be ashamed, and Democrats should be embarrassed. And therefore, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I am deeply frustrated. That is the response that we got today. We cannot agree on something as simple as standing by the officers who keep this building safe. Officers every one of us walk by every day. There are officers standing outside the floor right now, keeping watch as we are forced to debate whether it was not okay to pardon the people that violently attacked them. I don't know how my colleagues who oppose this simple resolution can look them in the eye. It is insulting enough that Speaker Johnson, someone who has a dedicated 24/7 detail, has refused to put up the plaque honoring the brave officers who kept us safe 4 years ago. But the fact that we can't pass a resolution as simple as the one I presented today, the fact that we can't all agree that we should side with the people who keep us safe over the people who are attacking us is disgraceful. It is unworthy of this body and unworthy of the sacrifice our Capitol Police have demonstrated time and again. We owe them better. I will not stop pushing to make sure we show them we understand that. The president may be able to grant pardons, commute sentences, release criminals, delete databases, but I will tell you here, he can take no action that will erase the past unless we let him. And as long as I can stand, as long as I can speak, as long as I am here, I will not let him or anyone rewrite the history of the January 6th resurrection or erase the important lessons that we must learn from it.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I rise in support of the resolution offered by my colleague from the state of Washington. I thank her for that. This is personal. For many of us, it's personal. We were here on the Senate floor on January 6, 2001. Vice President Pence was presiding. I was sitting at this very desk. And a few minutes after 2 o'clock, the Secret Service came in and literally removed him from his chair. We knew there were demonstrations outside, but we didn't know how serious or how violent they'd become. A few minutes after that, a Capitol policeman stood in front of this chamber and said to all of us, "Stay in this room, just take your seats, this is going to be a safe room. There'll be many people coming in here, and we'll keep them safe." And we didn't know what was happening outside, but we knew something serious was going on. We waited another 10 minutes. The same Capitol policeman said, "A change of orders. Leave immediately and exit through that door." And we all filed out through that door, headed for one of the buildings on Capitol Hill where there was a safe space for members of the Senate to meet. I wasn't sure what was going on in the House of Representatives. I still don't know all the details. But the reality was the mob, the insurrectionist mob, was taking over the Capitol. Thousands of people were storming into this building, not for a peaceful demonstration by any means, but sadly for violence and destruction. That day was the worst day I can recall in the history of the Senate in terms of our respect for this building that has become a symbol, not only for the United States, but for the world, for peace and democracy. And I thought of those poor Capitol policemen who were asked to defend us with their lives. They were asked to risk their lives for us, and they did. 4 or 5 of them lost their lives as a result of it, and over 140 were seriously injured. Some of the things that were done to them were outrageous. You've seen the videotape. We don't have to speculate on what it was. We saw it as they tore down building structures, as they beat up on these cops, as many of them faced death and knew at the time it was that serious. The grimmest reality of those riots was the subsequent death of 5 of these law enforcement officers and the injuries to approximately 140 others, many of whom still pay that price to this day. Last week, President Trump, who incited the violence, commuted the sentences of 14 individuals and granted full, complete, and unconditional pardons to approximately 1,500 others convicted of offenses related to the January 6th attack. Many of the perpetrators have shown a stunning lack of remorse following their violent assaults on the brave members of the U.S. Capitol Police and D.C. Metropolitan Police who protected my life and the lives of so many others that day. For example, last August, David Dempsey, just a few hours after receiving a 240-month prison sentence for attacking police on January 6th with a flagpole, crutches, pepper spray, pieces of furniture, called into a gathering of supporters from outside the D.C. jail. In reference to Trump's opponents, Mr. Dempsey said, quote, "Don't celebrate too hard, man, because the sentence is only going to last like 6 months." He knew that if President Trump were elected and had the power, he would pardon him, despite what he had done to the Capitol Police. Devlin Thompson attempted to throw a speaker at police officers, which ended up hitting and injuring a fellow rioter, and hit a police officer with a metal baton, according to court documents. Daniel D.J. Rodriguez, a California man who drove a stun gun into an officer's neck during one of the most violent clashes of the Capitol riot, was sentenced to more than 12 years in prison before President Trump granted him clemency. Andrew Taki pepper-sprayed police officers and hit one with a metal whip. He was supposed to serve 74 months in a federal prison in Beaumont, Texas, but he was pardoned by President Trump. These are just a few of the hundreds of individuals President Trump decided to pardon in this unconscionable executive order. The list of crimes committed by these thugs goes on for pages and pages and pages of the court document. Winston Churchill said once, "Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it." That is why we must continue sounding the alarm on the violence and chaos of that day to ensure it never happens again. We must also be clear that violence for political purposes is never, never acceptable. It It has no place in democracy. The men and women who bravely defended the members of this body deserve more, and we should honor them for their heroic efforts, not excuse the thugs who attacked this body and the ideals it represents. President Trump was wrong in pardoning these men who attacked the police. I thank Senator Murray for introducing this resolution condemning President Trump's pardons of January 6th of the insurrectionists who assaulted our brave law enforcement officers. And I'm disgusted that our Republican colleagues won't join us in honoring the men and now women who risk their lives every single day for us. They risk their lives for us. And Senator Murray has asked us to recognize that fact and say violence against them is never acceptable. We couldn't even get a bipartisan vote for that. It's a shame it's reached that point, but it has. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I stand before you today as the son of 2 police officers. Growing up in our family, service always came first. My mom was actually the first woman to become a police officer in our hometown of West Orange, New Jersey. Before that, she was working as a secretary and a waitress, often at the same time. Her becoming a cop meant more money for our family. It literally changed our lives. One day, my mom was seriously injured in the line of duty. When on patrol, she got a call about a burglary at a department store. She rushed to that store to help. The criminal attacked her pretty badly. She was injured, and her injuries forced her to retire. It ended her career. Now, that was a risk that she took for our community as a police officer. These are the same risks we see officers make every single day across our country, all 50 states, all the territories, and here in Washington, D.C. Our New Jersey community and her union, they had her back. The very idea of her attacker being let off the hook would have been outrageous. It would have been shocking. And it's almost impossible to imagine because it simply would have never happened. And yet, that's exactly what did happen when the president, Donald Trump, pardoned hundreds of criminals who violently assaulted Capitol police officers and D.C. police officers on January 6th. That was his priority on day one of his presidency. It wasn't to lower the price of gas or groceries or housing. It was to let violent criminals off the hook for storming this building and attacking the police, leaving many of them bleeding and bruised or worse. In some cases, much, much worse. Now, how does this line up with backing the blue? I don't get it. These pardons are an insult to every man and woman, like my parents, who served and serve our country in law enforcement. President Trump is sending a message that violence against cops is okay when it's done for him. That is a message that all of us must reject unequivocally. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise together with my colleagues to speak in opposition to the President's action pardoning those who attacked this Capitol on January 6, 2021. I was here that day. I shared that day with these colleagues, and we all have memories of it, memories that we never would have imagined and hope never to repeat. But I'm not going to talk about my experiences of the day. I'm going to talk about a friend, a Virginian, Howie Liebengood, a Capitol Police officer who spent his career protecting this building and who died as a result of that day. And the fact that President Trump would pardon the people who attacked this Capitol, leading to Howie Liebengood's death, is a deep, deep stain on President Trump and, frankly, a stain on this body if we casually tolerate it. Howie Liebengood is a Virginian who grew up in this building. His father was the Sergeant at Arms of the United States Senate, and prior to assuming that role, worked in other roles in the Senate. And Howie and his two siblings grew up coming to the Capitol and treating it like it was sort of their playground and their yard, running through the halls, meeting senators, hearing their dad tell stories about what it was like to serve this Article I branch as a patriotic American public servant. When Howie came of age, he started a career that he enjoyed and worked together with his father for a number of years as a NASCAR driver. And he worked on the NASCAR circuit, kind of working his way up from minor league races to more significant races. But after a number of years of doing that, look, he was a child of the United States Senate. He was a child of this Capitol. And he decided that he would enter the training program to be a Capitol Police officer. And he told his siblings, by this time his father had passed, he told his siblings, I think my dad would be very, very proud of me. Howie went through the academy and became a Capitol Police officer. And I came to know him, as I suspect many of my colleagues did, because he usually was staffing the Delaware door at the corner of Delaware and Constitution right here, the Delaware door into the Russell Building. And this is a door that I know Senator Murray's office is right close to that door, maybe the closest office to that door, and mine is close as well. We would come in the morning, and Howie Liebengood would be there to greet us, to ask us questions about the procedural vote from the night before or what was on today. As much as he was a friend of mine, he was even more of a friend of my staff. My staff loved interacting with Howie. And he eventually served as a Capitol Police officer for 15 years. He was here on January 6th when his beloved Capitol was attacked. And as devastating as that attack was for many of us, for Howie, who had made this place his whole life, who had really been raised in these halls, that attack was very devastating. In the aftermath of the attack, those working on the Capitol Police were put on extended hours, little sleep. Would there be more attacks? Where was this going? What would happen? It was a time of fear and anxiety and confusion. And a few days later, within 3 days after that attack of January 6th, Howie went to his home in Virginia. His wife, Serena, asked if he was doing okay. She could tell he was under enormous stress, and he said he just needed to sleep. And Howie went upstairs and, using his own service revolver, ended his life. Howie Liebengood would be alive today. Howie Liebengood would be alive today if President Trump hadn't urged people to gather to do something wild in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021, and then urged those gathering to go up and raise hell at the Capitol. My friend would be alive if President Trump had not done what he did. I've waited in vain, not naively, but with a hope that there might be some sign of remorse over what happened, for the pain suffered by Serena Liebengood and Howie's siblings and family members, for other law enforcement officers, all of whom lived in Virginia, lost their life as a result of that day. Dozens of others were injured, and I have waited for years to see if there might be some semblance of remorse shown by the president who inspired that attack for the damage and pain and loss of life and injury that he's caused, and I've seen not a shred of it. But these pardons are the ultimate injustice, are the ultimate injury. The family's still suffering. For them, it's salt in an unhealed wound and an injury that will never heal. And so I join with my colleagues in Howie's memory, in support of Serena, in support of Howie's family, to stand on this floor and deplore as strongly as I can, and words aren't sufficient to really explain how I feel about this, but I stand here to deplore as strongly as I can the pardons of these lawbreakers who gathered for a particular time, at a particular moment, in a particular place, to conduct violence in the cause of a particular result, the overturning of the peaceful transfer of power. And as I sit down, Mr. President, I'll just say this. I lived in a military dictatorship in 1980 and 81 in Honduras when the military ran everything. I know what authoritarianism is. I didn't live there for years like my Honduran friends, but I experienced it. I was very naive. I was 22 years old when I lived there, and I saw what it's like to have a society run by somebody who believes they are all powerful, who can change any rule, who can foment violence, who can make sure that those who commit violence escape with impunity. I know what this is like, and we are in danger of moving into the same kind of authoritarian behavior when we casually pardon and excuse those who perpetrate violence to overturn our democracy. That's a big concept, but it all comes down to the effect that it has on individual people like my friend Howie Liebengood. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, many of us who were here on January 6th have pretty indelible memories. I'm looking at Senator Murray, who had particularly harrowing memories. One of mine is I was one of the last people out of the Senate. And by the time we got to the room where we were sequestered for our own protection from the mob, colleagues were irate. And they had been frightened. There is footage of Republican senators running through the halls to get away from the mob. I remember one of our colleagues shouting out that we should get back over here to vote, even if it meant protesters would have to be shot. Again, a Republican. There were 600 of the rioters here who committed violence on police officers. Nearly 200 of them used weapons. They were convicted of this after all proper, fair procedures in an American court of law. And then the notion of pardons started to come up. And we were basically shushed by our Republican colleagues. Oh, that will never happen. The vice president said, if you committed violence on January 6th, you shouldn't be pardoned. In fact, he said, obviously, you shouldn't be pardoned. And another colleague in the Judiciary Committee chastised Democrats for asking the Attorney General nominee, what would she do with respect to the violent January 6th protesters? Would she recommend that the president pardon them? And we were chastised for the absurdity of that question. That is an, quote, absurd and unfair hypothetical to even ask. Over in the House, Jim Jordan said that he didn't think anybody violent was going to be pardoned. I think, he said, he's going to focus on all the people who didn't commit any violence. Another colleague on the Judiciary Committee said he was against any such pardons for people who assaulted cops, threw stuff at cops, broke down doors, broke windows. We heard this cascade of denial from the other side about these pardons. It was unfathomable that he would do this. It was wrong that he would do this. It was absurd that he would do this. And then he did it. And what happened? Well, two things happened. One, over 1,000 people who have demonstrated their willingness to commit acts of political violence at the behest of Donald Trump were set loose on the streets. We haven't heard the last of them. There may be another call to arms. Will be wild, be there. We haven't heard the last of them. But just the leading edge, in only the week since we've been there, one's already been arrested for a violent confrontation with police officers. Another was killed in a shooting incident when he refused to be arrested and engaged police officers with a weapon. And a third is in Rhode Island in our ACI, in our Adult Correctional Institute, for having challenged police officers in an armed standoff. Now, he was in prison when he was pardoned. Nobody in this pardon operation thought to understand that this guy actually was convicted again of violence against police officers and sentenced to a long term of imprisonment in my state. So we know there's going to be more violence from these people. We know that Trump now has an on-call assault team that he can use to launch political violence just the way he did on January 6th. And this is a dangerous situation. This ought to be the easiest vote in the world. How you can even walk through these halls and look at our Capitol police officers in the eye, the ones who were there, the ones who took their lives in their hands to steer the mob away from vulnerable senators. How you can look them in the eye if you haven't supported this, I don't know. There is a word in the English language, subservience. I think we need a new word called Trump-servience, in which things you know you shouldn't do, you do anyway because you're either frightened of Trump or want to suck up to him. This is not a great moment. And there is an effort, frankly, to erase that incident. For a long time, oh, just peaceful protesters. This was all just, happy people coming in to visit the Capitol, fun and games. Yeah, so fun that we had senators running down the aisles to get away from them. So fun that to get back into this building, we had armed SWAT officers with automatic weapons lining the entire pathway back from where we were secured into this chamber. Just remember what our colleagues were saying in that time period. But the effort to erase this moment goes on. It occurred just recently in the Judiciary Committee when the Attorney General nominee said that there had been a peaceful transfer of power. Like January 6th never happened. I asked a question for the record, asked her to explain that. She said, well, on Inauguration Day it was peaceful. You remember why it was peaceful on Inauguration Day? Because we had the Capitol of the United States surrounded by more soldiers, more police officers, more fencing, more snipers, more law enforcement and military safety people than had probably been the case since the Civil War. And yet now everything's peaceful. We cannot forget what happened here. It is wrong to forget what happened here. It is an insult to this Capitol to forget what happened here. It is an insult to the men and women of the Capitol Police Department and the DC Police Department and the others who came in to fill in when they were overwhelmed by these brutal rioters. So I'm glad that Senator Murray did this. I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak on their behalf, both for the sake of those police officers and for the sake of the truth and for the sake of our history here. This deserves to be remembered. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from California.
8 days ago, democracy and the rule of law were dealt another blow. It wasn't at the hands of a mob this time. No bear spray, no battering rams, no chants of "Hang Mike Pence" or "Where's Nancy" echoing through these halls. This time, when the blow came, it made barely a sound. No screaming rioters in military garb and Viking helmets. Only a president in a suit and tie with the demure flourish of a pen. 8 days ago, President Trump pardoned over 1,500 people who assaulted this Capitol, brutalized police officers, and sought to overthrow a free and fair election. Among them were the ringleaders of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, violent, unrepentant white nationalists who orchestrated an insurrection. Some who were convicted of seditious conspiracy, others of beating police officers, of dragging them into a mob, of bear spraying them, of crushing them in a revolving door. Horrifying, sickening stuff. And with the flick of a wrist, their benefactor, their inspiration, Donald Trump erased their crimes and handed them something unthinkable in a democratic society: absolution in the form of pardons and clemency. This was not mercy, this was madness. 1,550 pardons, 1,550 acts of absolution for those who committed violence against our Constitution and against those who swore to defend it. 1,550 get-out-of-jail-free cards handed to individuals who tried to overturn a free and fair election. And make no mistake, these pardons were a promise that if you commit violence in Donald Trump's name, you'll be protected, you'll be hailed, even glorified for your violence. A promise that no matter how egregious your actions on behalf of this president may be, accountability will not find you. A promise that America will now have to live with the fear that January 6th may not be the last of the violence in service of this president. Mr. President, Senator Kaine was saying, we have seen what happens when democracies falter, when leaders resort to violence, and when those who are meant to stop them lose their will, when those who defy the rule of law are exalted instead of prosecuted. History is littered with the wreckage of nations whose leaders decided that violence for them was more important than justice, more important than the law, more important than the people. And sadly, these pardons are not the last action the president will take to bend and subvert the rule of law to his will. Already we've seen this president and his Justice Department fire those who led a completely justified investigation into him, which led to indictments, and if allowed to proceed to a jury, would likely have led to his conviction. We have seen his Justice Department announce an investigation into the investigators and those who prosecuted important cases against January 6th violent criminals. We've seen this Justice Department, his Justice Department, reassign those who were viewed as not loyal enough. And we will see a lot more before the week, the month, and the year are out, much more. And if we are to remain a democracy, we had better see much more done to stop it. In this body, in this vital check on the power of the executive, we must see more done to stop it. We must draw a line here. We must draw a line now. The Vice President argued that these pardons are about liberty. They are not. I ask you, what does liberty look like to the police officer who was beaten with a pole that once held the flag he was sworn to defend? What does liberty look like to the congressional staff who barricaded themselves in their offices listening to the chaos outside? What does liberty look like to the families of those who died as a result of the violence that day? Liberty and justice don't come from pardoning the perpetrators of violence. It comes from ensuring that violence is not repeated, condoned,
absolved. The question before us is simple, one that our founders answered correctly, and that today we must answer again. Are we a nation of laws? Or are we a nation of men? Or more specifically, of one man, above accountability, beyond reproach? Because make no mistake, we cannot be both. What does it say if the Senate cannot and will not pass such a straightforward recognition of the law enforcement officers who protect us, or a condemnation of the rioters who attacked them and tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power? It says that we are willing to see our cherished legacy die with a whimper, one sordid absolution after another. It is really that simple. I urge my colleagues to join me, to join us in condemning this most grotesque abuse of power. Condemn these pardons. I yield back.
Mr. President,
The senator from Minnesota.
I thank the senator from Washington and Senator Schumer and Durbin for bringing us together to condemn the pardons and what happened. But I also want to first express my dissatisfaction about what's happening with this administration in just the first week. It was only a week ago that we gathered in the Capitol Rotunda, and as I said that day, there's a reason we have 3 branches of government under the Constitution. And the first article is Article 1 that establishes the Congress and makes very clear our job to have people's backs. And what has happened with an order in the middle of the night, just a letter from a bureaucrat in which one person can what? Basically get ahead of the Constitution. I think we have gathered here today to say no. This has real consequences for people's lives. I think about the mom who didn't know this morning if she can send her kid to childcare. I think about the teenager, and I was contacted about this in a cancer study, hoping that it's going to save his life. I think about the woman in an abusive relationship who has nowhere to go because her local domestic violence shelter couldn't take her in. We heard today our office from a domestic violence organization in Minnesota that said it could not access critical funding. We think about the first responders, the firefighters all over our country. We think about what we saw them doing in Los Angeles over the past month. Grants that pay for their equipment, funding that pays for them to allow them to hire firefighters. This is not acceptable. It is not the executive branch's decision to make. It is Congress's job to direct funding through laws passed by both chambers. Often, in fact, the laws we're dealing with here clearly had bipartisan support. That's how they got in when we had one House that was Republican and one House that was Democratic. Now that switched, they're both Republican, but the money and the funding, that was supported by both parties. The American people have sent us here to represent our constituents, and that is what we are doing. So this chaos that we've seen today with multiple groups and people not knowing what was happening reminds me that the last Trump administration, we saw the same thing. Just a few days ago, the president issued blanket pardons for the insurrectionists who desecrated this very building on January 6, 2021. It is a shocking display of disrespect for the law, enforcement heroes who defended our democracy. And I will say I have been critical of pardons from presidents of both parties. I think we desperately need pardon reform. While it is the power of the president, when you look at what governors do across the country, they actually have commissions set up that make recommendations on pardons. You could still have the power to pardon, but you could make recommendations and more thoroughly look at these cases on a case-by-case basis. So January 6th and the assault on our democracy, many of us were there. I was the one with Senator Blunt, the former senator of Missouri. We were the leads on the Rules Committee And we were the ones at 3:30 in the morning, when everyone had gone home, that made that walk with Vice President Pence. It was just the three of us and 3 pairs of young women holding the mahogany boxes with the electoral ballots that one of the young pages had the wherewithal and the parliamentarian staff to get out of the chamber before it was evaded. And in the morning when we made that walk, it was a celebration, pomp and circumstance, everyone following behind us. And then that night at 3:30 in the morning, we had officers with scratches on their faces, over 100 of them injured. And we made that walk over broken glass and by pillars spray painted with racist vulgarities. But we made that walk and democracy prevailed. And part of that democracy was to make sure that those who violated the law, those who assaulted the police officers, those who had members of our staff, people always focus on the members of Congress, but so many members of our staffs were hiding, my staff hiding in the little kitchen downstairs with knives in their hands for 3 hours behind a door, 2 of them in this little closet off the kitchen. That story was repeated throughout the Capitol. These were assaults. This was a violent mob that attacked our democracy and attacked brave men and women of the Capitol Police who were defending it. Over the last 4 years, I have led bipartisan hearings to examine the events and the security failures. I did that with Senator Blunt and Senator Portman and Senator Peters. And we have 103 recommendations that came out of the Inspector General and dozens out of our committees, and Chief Manger has met the challenge, all 103 recommendations. We have increased morale. We've got the fact that we've got more police officers. We've hired hundreds more. And then the gut punch of these pardons, the gut punch to justice, the gut punch to these police officers. They were the heroes that day, not the criminals that stormed the Capitol because they didn't like the election result. To pardon these criminals, many of them convicted of very serious felonies, is to endorse political violence. It is a slap in the face of the men and women of law enforcement who showed true patriotism that day. And it is truly an affront to our democracy. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, we have several other colleagues who are going to come later to speak about this as well. I want to thank everyone who is here today. We want to make it very clear, we will not forget what happened on January 6th. I don't care what records they erased or what kind of news stories they want to tell. We know what happened. This country cannot forget. And today we are here simply to say that the Senate disapproves of the pardons for individuals who are found guilty of assaulting Capitol Police officers. I am disappointed that our Republican colleagues today refuse to join us. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.